September 2006, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The screens glowed blue in the dark room at Kandahar Airfield. Canadian Brigadier General David Fraser stood with his arms crossed, watching the live drone footage. On the monitors, tiny figures moved through fields of grapes and mud walls. These were Canadian soldiers. They were walking straight into hell. The radio crackled with voices, gunfire, explosions, men screaming coordinates. Fraser watched as the Canadians pushed forward into a wall of Taliban bullets. He watched them take hits and keep moving. He watched them fall and saw others drag them to cover while still shooting. He had seen many battles in his career. He had never seen anything quite like this. In the days that followed, Fraser would tell his American colleagues something they did not expect to hear. He said he had never seen soldiers fight like this. Not anywhere, not ever. This is the story of what American generals witnessed when 2,000 Canadian soldiers did something the world had forgotten Canadians could do. They waged brutal close-quarters combat against an enemy that wanted to destroy them. They took terrible losses. They buried their friends, and they refused to break. By September 2006, Afghanistan was falling apart. The Taliban had been beaten in 2001. Everyone said so. The news showed their leaders running to Pakistan. The war was over, except it was not over at all. The Taliban had spent 5 years hiding and rebuilding. Now they were coming back. Not as small groups planting bombs. They were coming back as an army. The numbers told a scary story. And Taliban attacks had jumped by 400% since the year before. In Kandahar province alone, there had been 1,200 attacks in just 8 months. 191 NATO soldiers would die that year. It was the worst year since the war began. 25 kilometers west of Kandahar city sat a district called Panjwai. Something very bad was happening there. The Taliban had gathered between 1,500 and 2,000 fighters. They were not hiding in mountains like guerrillas. They were digging into villages and thick mud buildings. They were daring NATO to come and get them. They had picked their ground. They wanted a real battle. They believed they could win. Canada had sent soldiers to Kandahar earlier that year. They took over from American forces. Most Canadians back home thought this would be a peacekeeping mission. Canada had not fought a major ground battle since Korea. The Canadian military had spent decades keeping peace. They wore blue helmets. They watched ceasefires. They helped refugees. Now, 2,300 Canadian soldiers were responsible for the most dangerous province in Afghanistan. The enemy in front of them had more fighters in that one district than Canada had soldiers in the entire province. The Taliban commanders studied their maps and smiled. They knew Canadians were not Americans. They knew Canadians were peacekeepers. Soft, careful, weak. The Taliban believed that when the Canadians saw their friends dying, they would run away. They would quit and go home. The Taliban were about to learn how wrong they were. Over the next 17 days, American generals would watch something unfold that changed how they saw their northern allies forever. They would see Canadian soldiers fight and die in ways that shocked even combat veterans. They would hear stories of bravery that seemed impossible. But what exactly did those American commanders witness that so completely changed their minds? And what price did those young Canadian soldiers pay to earn that respect? To understand what made Operation Medusa so remarkable, you must first understand what the Canadian military had become, and what it had forgotten. In World War II, Canadian soldiers earned a fearsome reputation. German troops called them stormtroopers. They were tough. They were relentless. They won battles that seemed impossible. At Vimy Ridge in the First War and Juno Beach in the Second, and Canadians proved they could fight as well as anyone on Earth. Then everything changed. In 1956, Canada helped create the idea of United Nations peacekeeping. It was a noble mission. Canadian soldiers would stand between warring sides. They would watch ceasefires. They would protect civilians. For the next 50 years, this became who Canada was: peacekeepers, not warriors. By 2006, the Canadian military was a shadow of what it had been. They had not fought a major battle since Korea in 1953. Many at the Pentagon saw Canada as a reliable friend but a soft ally. Good for handing out food, not so good for fighting. In 2005, Canada made a choice that would change everything. Instead of staying safe in Kabul, they volunteered to take over Kandahar province. It was the Taliban heartland. General Rick Hillier pushed for this mission. He was the head of Canada's military, a blunt man from Newfoundland who spoke his mind. He told his soldiers plainly that they were not going to help old ladies cross the street. They were going to war. The soldiers who deployed included the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry from Edmonton, the Royal Canadian Regiment from Petwawa, the Lord Strathcona's Horse, Canada's famous armored regiment, gunners from the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Lieutenant Colonel Omar Lavoie commanded the battle group on the ground. He was smart and calm under pressure. Major Matthew Sprague led Charles' company of the Royal Canadian Regiment. His men would see the worst of the fighting. Captain John Hamilton was a young officer who would become one of the battle's lasting symbols. He was 26 years old and newly married. While the Canadians prepared, the Taliban were planning something no one expected. Under commanders like Mullah Dadullah, a brutal one-legged fighter some called the Taliban's Patton, they decided to stand and fight a real battle. Their plan was simple but deadly. Mass nearly 2,000 fighters in the Panjwai district, fortify the villages, turn the grape-drying huts into bunkers. The Taliban created overlapping fields of fire. They pre-registered their mortars on every approach. They studied NATO tactics and placed their positions near civilian homes, knowing the Canadians would hesitate to bomb families. Before Medusa, life for Canadian soldiers in Kandahar had been tense but manageable. Patrols, small firefights, roadside bombs. They dealt with heat that reached 50 degrees Celsius, dust that jammed their rifles, scorpions hiding in their boots. They had lost soldiers. 4 died in a single day in August during fighting near Panjwai, but nothing prepared them for what was coming. In late August, intelligence reports painted a terrifying picture. The Taliban were not running away. They were digging deeper, reinforcing, getting ready for a major stand. General Fraser made the call. NATO would not wait. They would attack first. The Canadian soldiers checked their weapons and wrote letters home. Some of them would never write another. The plan for Operation Medusa looked simple on paper. Canadian and Allied forces would attack from several directions. They would clear the Taliban strongholds in Panjwai district. They would restore government control. Maps made it look easy. Clean arrows pointing at targets. Neat boxes showing objectives. The reality was a nightmare. Panjwai was a green zone, a belt of farms along the Arghandab River, fed by ancient irrigation channels. Unlike the brown deserts around it, this place was alive with growing things. But those growing things would kill. Grapevines grew on raised mud rows standing 4 to 6 feet high. These rows created walls that blocked everything. Soldiers could not see through them. Vehicles could not drive over them. Every few meters was another wall, another blind corner, another place for the enemy to hide. Between the grape rows grew marijuana plants. Some stood 8 to 10 feet tall. A man could hide inside them and never be seen. Perfect for ambushes. Each village was a maze of mud-walled compounds with walls 2 feet thick, and everywhere stood the grape-drying huts. Afghans used these buildings to dry grapes into raisins, but their walls were 4 feet of solid mud brick. Artillery shells sometimes bounced off them. They were better than bunkers. The Taliban defending this ground were not farmers with old rifles. They included foreign fighters from Pakistan, Chechnya, and Arab countries. Men who had fought before and knew how to kill. Their commanders had battled the Soviets in the 1980s. They had heavy weapons, mortars that could drop shells with deadly accuracy, rocket-propelled grenades that could destroy vehicles, machine guns that could cut men in half. They had prepared positions connected by tunnels. They knew exactly where their mortars would land before firing a single shot. They had studied how NATO fought. They knew Canadians would call in airstrikes. So they built their fighting positions next to homes where families lived. They gambled that the Canadians would not bomb civilians. They gambled right. Operation Medusa began on September 2, 2006. The crisis arrived within 24 hours. On September 3rd, Charles' company of the Royal Canadian Regiment moved toward their objective. They called it Objective Rugby, a cluster of Taliban compounds and grape huts. As they approached, they walked straight into a trap. The Taliban opened fire from everywhere at once: machine guns, rockets, mortars. The Canadians were caught in a crossfire with bullets coming from multiple directions. Their vehicles got stuck in the soft earth between grape rows. Radios filled with confused voices. The thick vegetation made it impossible to see where the enemy was shooting from. Sergeant Patrick Tower tried to direct his men. He could not see the Taliban, but the Taliban could see him. Bullets snapped past from every angle. He could not tell his soldiers where to shoot back. Then came the disaster that would haunt everyone who survived. During the chaos, 2 American A-10 attack planes were called in to help. Someone gave them the wrong coordinates. In the early morning darkness of September 4th, the planes opened fire on the Canadian command post. 30mm cannon shells tore through the position. The burst lasted only seconds. Private Mark Anthony Graham died instantly. He was a medic who had been treating wounded soldiers. More soldiers fell around him. More than 30 Canadians were hit. Major Matthew Sprague, the company commander, took shrapnel to his head and chest. In one terrible moment, Charles' company's leadership was shattered. Back at Kandahar airfield, American commanders watched the attack collapse into chaos. Friendly fire casualties, pinned down units. The assault had failed before it truly started. Would the Canadians retreat? Would they quit? Everything hung in the balance. The smoke had barely cleared from the friendly fire disaster when Lieutenant Colonel Omer Lavoie got on the radio. His voice was steady despite everything that had just happened. His men were bleeding. His officers were down. The attack had ground to a halt. General David Fraser faced a choice. He could pause the operation, pull everyone back, regroup, and try again another day. It was the safe choice, the expected choice. No one would blame him after what had just happened. But Lavoie told him something that changed everything. We can still do this, he said. My soldiers want to finish this. Fraser looked at the young Canadian officers around him. He saw something in their eyes he had not seen in a long time. They were angry, they were grieving, and they wanted to go back in. They wanted to make the Taliban pay for every drop of Canadian blood. The attack would continue. What happened over the next 11 days would reshape how American generals saw Canadian soldiers forever. The Canadians learned fast. Moving through the grape fields in daylight was suicide. Taliban observers sat in high positions watching every move. They directed devastating fire onto anyone who showed themselves. So Canadian commanders made a bold decision. They would attack at night. Canadian soldiers had trained for years using night vision equipment. The Taliban had not. In darkness, the Canadians became ghosts, deadly ghosts. Sergeant Mike Denine led his section through the grape rows at 2 in the morning. They moved so quietly they could hear Taliban fighters talking in the compounds ahead. They crept within grenade range before anyone knew they were there. Then the killing started. It was close fighting, the closest kind, bayonets and rifle butts, hand-to-hand combat in the dark, things that soldiers hope they never have to do. Denine later said he saw things he never thought he would see. The Canadians invented new ways to fight. Instead of using doors, which the Taliban often rigged with bombs, they blasted holes through compound walls. They called it mouse-holing. Canadian snipers took positions on high ground and killed Taliban fighters at distances over 1,500 meters. The enemy learned to fear open ground. The LAV-3 armored vehicles became crucial weapons. Their 25mm cannons could punch through the thick grape hut walls when nothing else worked. But when vehicles could not advance, soldiers went forward on foot, into the fields, into the kill zones. The grape-drying huts became the defining horror of the battle. Each one was a tiny fortress. The Taliban had cut firing holes in the walls. They had reinforced positions with sandbags. They had dug tunnels connecting buildings so fighters could escape or reinforce. Corporal Ryan Farnsworth described clearing one of these huts. His team put an 84mm rocket through the wall. They waited. Silence. They went inside. The dust was so thick they could barely breathe. 3 Taliban lay dead inside. But there was another doorway. More enemy behind it. They went room to room for an hour. 15 Taliban fighters died in that one building. 15 men who had to be killed one by one. Canadian gunners fired more than 4,000 artillery rounds during Medusa. It was the heaviest Canadian bombardment since Korea over 50 years earlier. The big guns rained 155mm shells on Taliban positions day and night. Grape huts collapsed. Bunkers caved in. The ground shook for miles. By September 10th, Canadian casualties were mounting fast. 12 soldiers killed in action, more than 40 wounded. For a small force of about 2,000 soldiers, these numbers were staggering. Then on September 14th, the final Taliban position fell. Canadian and Allied forces overran the last major stronghold near Objective Rugby. Inside, they found ammunition from Iran and China, medical supplies showing the Taliban had suffered massive casualties, documents revealing how much the enemy had prepared, and bodies, hundreds of bodies. The Taliban's conventional army had been destroyed. American officers embedded with the Canadians were stunned. They had expected a professional but careful force. What they witnessed was something else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Grooney, an American watching from inside a Canadian unit, said these guys never stopped. They took casualties that would have made other units pause. They did not pause. Officers led from the front. That is not how everyone does it. When the guns finally stopped in Panjwai, the scale of what happened became painfully clear. The grape fields fell silent. The mortars stopped falling. Smoke drifted over shattered compounds and collapsed grape huts. Now came the terrible work of counting the dead. The toll was devastating. 16 Canadian soldiers would ultimately die when counting the battles before and after Medusa. More than 40 Canadians had been wounded, many of them badly. Some lost limbs, others lost eyes. 5 vehicles lay destroyed or burning in the fields. For a military that had lost only 4 soldiers in Afghanistan during the previous 4 years combined, this was a seismic shock. The earth had shifted under Canadian feet. The Taliban fared far worse. NATO estimated between 500 and 1,000 enemy fighters dead. The true number was impossible to count. Bodies lay in grape huts and irrigation ditches. Mass graves were discovered for weeks afterward. and captured Taliban fighters described entire units wiped out. One enemy commander, who was caught later, made a stunning admission. "We thought we could beat the Canadians because they were not Americans," he said. "We were wrong. They fought like devils." At Kandahar airfield, American officers gathered to speak with Canadian soldiers returning from the battle. These were men covered in dust and dried blood, men who had not slept in days, men who had watched friends die in their arms. Colonel Steve Williams, deputy commander of the American task force, watched them closely. He saw soldiers who had lost everything still asking when they could go back in. "That is not training," he said. "That is not doctrine. That is character." Major General Benjamin Freakley commanded the American 10th Mountain Division. Why, he flew to meet the Canadian battle group personally. His assessment went into official reports that would be read in the Pentagon. The Canadian soldiers demonstrated aggressive infantry tactics that exceeded expectations, he wrote. Their willingness to engage the enemy at close range is remarkable for any modern military. Back in Canada, the casualties dominated every newspaper and television screen. Prime Minister Stephen Harper flew to Kandahar just days after the battle ended. He walked among the soldiers, shaking hands, listening to their stories. He was visibly moved by what he heard and saw. "These young men and women have shown the world what Canada is capable of," he said. "They have reminded us that Canadian soldiers are among the finest in the world." But the images of flag-draped coffins traveling down the highway of heroes shook the nation. Arguments broke out over whether the mission was worth the blood being spilled. Even amid the carnage, there were moments that showed the best of human nature. Private Jess Larochelle found a wounded Taliban fighter after his team cleared a compound. The enemy soldier was perhaps 18 years old. He had been shot through both legs and was crying out for his mother. Canadian medics treated him anyway. These were the same medics who had just lost friends to Taliban bullets. They gave the young man morphine for his pain and bandaged his wounds. "That is who we are," Larochelle said later. Canadian forces treated dozens of wounded enemy fighters during and after the battle. Medical teams did not ask which side a bleeding man had fought for. Some Taliban wounded were evacuated by Canadian helicopters to hospitals where surgeons worked to save their lives. Brigadier General David Fraser gathered his commanders in the days after Medusa ended. His words were recorded in official documents. "What I witnessed was the Canadian soldier doing what Canadian soldiers have always done," he said. "When asked to do the impossible, they find a way. I am humbled to have served with them. And I know our American allies will never again question what Canada brings to a fight." The grape fields of Panjwai had become sacred ground, watered with blood, marked by sacrifice. The Canadians had proven something that many had forgotten. They could fight, they could win, and they would pay any price to protect their own and finish the mission. Hey, quick pause. Every video I make is about keeping these stories alive. Stories of young Canadians who gave everything and never got to tell their own tale. If you think that matters, hit subscribe. Help me make sure this all will never be forgotten. Now, back to the video. Operation Medusa achieved everything it was supposed to achieve. The Taliban conventional forces were destroyed. They would never again try to hold ground with a massed army. Kandahar city, which had been at risk of falling before the battle, remained in government hands. NATO had proven it could conduct major combat operations far from home. But the impact of those 17 days went far deeper than anyone expected. The Taliban learned a brutal lesson in the grape fields of Panjwai. Standing and fighting against NATO forces meant death, complete and total destruction. So they changed how they fought. After Medusa, they abandoned conventional warfare entirely. They shifted to roadside bombs and small ambushes. a war of patience designed to bleed NATO slowly until Western countries lost the will to fight. In this way, Medusa was both a great victory and a turning point. It shaped everything that came afterward in the Afghan War. The battle fundamentally changed how American military leaders viewed Canada. General David Petraeus, who would later command all coalition forces in Afghanistan, spoke about the Canadians during testimony to the United States Congress. Our Canadian allies have demonstrated extraordinary valor in some of the toughest fighting this coalition has faced, he said. They have earned the respect of every American soldier who has served alongside them. Inside the Pentagon, assessments were written that praised the Canadian performance. These reports noted that Canadian forces showed a capacity for sustained high-intensity combat that exceeded all expectations. The willingness of Canadian infantry to engage in close combat while accepting significant casualties was particularly impressive. American units heading to Kandahar in later years were briefed on Canadian tactics at Medusa. The battle became a case study at American military schools. By the time Canada ended its combat mission in 2011, the numbers told a staggering story. 158 Canadian soldiers died in Afghanistan. Compared to population size, this was a higher death rate than the United States suffered. Canada sent more combat troops relative to its population than almost any NATO ally except Britain and Denmark. Over 2,000 Canadians were wounded, many with injuries that would change their lives forever. Operation Medusa was the first major offensive conducted under full NATO command. And its success proved the alliance could fight real wars far from Europe, but it also exposed problems. Other NATO nations faced pressure to send combat forces rather than staying in safer areas. Germany, France, and Italy were criticized for avoiding the hard fighting. The problem of some nations fighting while others did not became a major political issue. Canada's sacrifice gave it moral authority in these debates. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed how the enemy viewed what had happened. The Canadians do not fight like peacekeepers, one Taliban report stated. They are very aggressive. They do not stop when they take casualties. Their artillery is very accurate. Their snipers are very dangerous. One Taliban commander reportedly ordered his men to avoid Canadian sectors whenever possible. "You fight the Italians or the Germans," he told them. "The Canadians will follow you and kill you." The soft peacekeepers had become something else entirely. The men in the grape fields had rewritten how the world saw Canadian soldiers. American generals, who had once wondered what Canada could contribute, now had their answer. It was written in Taliban blood across the Panjwai district. Behind the statistics and strategy were real people, young men who left homes in small Canadian towns and never came back. Survivors who returned changed forever, families who still wait for fathers and sons who exist now only in photographs. Captain John Hamilton was 26 years old when he died on September 3, 2006. He was leading his men in the assault on Objective Rugby when enemy fire cut him down. The friendly fire disaster would come the next morning, adding more grief to an already devastating day. He had grown up in Edmonton, the son of a military family. He had been married for less than 2 years. His widow Julie became an advocate for veterans after his death. In an interview years later, she spoke about her husband. "John believed in what he was doing," she said. "He believed Canada had a role to play in making the world safer. I will not let anyone say his death was meaningless. The children in those villages matter." John knew that. Captain Hamilton received the Star of Military Valor after his death. It is Canada's second highest award for bravery. Corporal Anthony Joseph Bonecka was 21 years old. He came from Thunder Bay, Ontario. He was killed on July 9, 2006, in the operations leading up to Medusa. He was the first Canadian soldier to die in the build-up to the Great Battle. His mother, Patty, traveled to Afghanistan years later to see where her son had served. She walked the same ground he had walked. She felt the same brutal heat. She saw the mud walls and the endless fields. "I needed to understand," she said. "When I walked those fields, I understood. This was a war, a real war." My son died as a warrior. Master Corporal Aaron Doyle served as a sniper during Operation Medusa. The number of enemy fighters he killed was never officially revealed, but fellow soldiers spoke quietly of his deadly skill. Years later, Doyle struggled with the invisible wounds of war. Post-traumatic stress disorder haunted him like a ghost that would not leave. In an interview, he tried to explain what service really meant. "People thank me for my service. Or," he said, "I appreciate that. But they do not know what service means. It means watching friends die. It means taking lives. It means coming home and not being able to explain any of it to the people you love." Doyle became an advocate for mental health services for veterans. He turned his pain into purpose by helping others who suffered as he did. Sergeant Bill Parsons had joined the Army at 17. During Medusa, he was 40 years old, ancient by infantry standards. He was everywhere during the battle, leading patrols, calming frightened young soldiers, organizing supply runs under fire. He kept telling the young soldiers that Canadians had done this before. Korea, World War II, Vimy Ridge. "This is what Canadian soldiers do," he said. "We go into impossible situations and we find a way." Parsons survived Medusa and retired in 2010. He returned to his hometown in New Brunswick, where he coaches youth hockey. He rarely speaks of the war. Private Kevin Dallaire was barely 19 during the battle. He had joined the Army straight out of high school in a small Saskatchewan town. "I was terrified," he admitted years later. "Absolutely terrified. But you cannot show it. Your buddies are counting on you, so you move. You do your job. You cry later, alone." Dallaire was wounded by shrapnel on September 14th, the last day of major combat. He lost partial use of his left hand. Today, he works helping other veterans navigate their return to civilian life. Not all victims wore uniforms. Haji Abdul Rahman was a farmer who fled Panjwai during the fighting. He returned to find his home destroyed. His crops were gone. Everything he had built lay in ruins. "The Taliban brought war to our village," he said. "The Canadians brought more war to push them out. My home, my crops, gone. But the Taliban would have killed my sons for going to school. The Canadians built the school." His words captured the impossible complexity of the war. There were no simple answers, only hard choices written in blood and dust. The fallen of Operation Medusa are remembered in stone and bronze across Canada. At the National War Memorial in Ottawa, their names are carved for eternity. The Afghanistan Memorial Vigil travels the country, carrying photographs of each of the 158 Canadians who died in the war. The Afghanistan Memorial Hall stands at National Defense Headquarters, a quiet place where soldiers and families can remember. The Highway of Heroes stretches across Ontario. It renamed to honor the route that carried so many flag-draped coffins home. In Kandahar, little physical trace of the battle remains. The grape fields have regrown. The mud-walled compounds were rebuilt by families who returned when the fighting stopped. Life continued in Panjwai for 15 years. Then, in 2021, the Taliban returned. They took back the province without a fight. They took back the country. Everything the Canadians had fought and died for seemed to vanish like morning mist. Operation Medusa changed how the Canadian forces trained and fought. The lessons paid for in blood transformed equipment, tactics, and doctrine. Mental health resources increased, though soldiers would say never enough. The battle is still studied at Canadian Forces College as a model of how to adapt under fire. American war colleges teach it too. But the lessons carved into doctrine among the grape huts still matter to soldiers who were not yet born when the battle was fought. For Canada, Operation Medusa marked a turning point that remains contested. Some Canadians embraced the rediscovery of their military heritage. Books and documentaries celebrated the soldiers of Kandahar. The phrase, "we are not just peacekeepers," became common. Pride in the military grew in ways not seen since World War II. Others questioned the cost. 158 dead. Over 2,000 wounded. For what? The Taliban won in the end. They rule Afghanistan again. Girls cannot go to school. The government. The Canadians died. Protecting no longer exists. Colonel Ian Hope commanded the Canadian battle group before Medusa. He watched many of his soldiers die in the months leading up to the Great Battle. Years later, he offered his judgment. History will judge Afghanistan harshly, he said. But history should not judge those soldiers. They did everything asked of them and more. They showed that Canada still produces warriors. That matters, even if politicians squander their sacrifices. What did American generals say when they saw Canadian soldiers fight? The answers came in hundreds of statements over the years. General Stanley McChrystal led special operations and later commanded all coalition forces. "I have served with soldiers from dozens of nations," he said. "The Canadians in Kandahar were among the finest I have ever seen. They fought and died with a valor that honored their history." General David Petraeus specifically thanked Canadian forces for their extraordinary contributions to the security of Kandahar province. Perhaps the most fitting words came from an anonymous Canadian soldier who survived Medusa. "People ask if it was worth it," he said. "I do not know how to answer that. My friends died there. I killed people there. I changed there. But I will tell you this. When those American generals watched us fight, they saw something real. They saw that Canadians, when we need to, can be as hard and as brave as anyone who ever wore a uniform. That was not a surprise to us. It was a reminder to everyone else." A sun-bleached Canadian flag still flew over the forward base on September 15th, 2006. Around it stood exhausted soldiers with haunted eyes. In the distance, the grape fields stretched toward the mountains, silent at last. Above them, American helicopters circled. Their crews looked down at the soldiers who had earned a new kind of respect. The cost was written on every face below.
December 18th, 1970. The Norwegian Sea, 200 meters beneath a steel-grey surface that the crew of Project 61 Ancha, NATO designation Papa class, would not see for another 6 hours. The submarine's commanding officer stood in the central command post, studying the depth gauge with the focused attention of a man who had just achieved what Western intelligence analysts would later classify as impossible. The air inside the titanium pressure hull carried the acrid chemical scent of lead bismuth coolant, a smell that had become as familiar as seawater to the 180 men sealed inside this experimental vessel. Temperature gauges throughout the engineering compartment read 43 degrees Celsius. The reactor spaces were hotter. K-222 had just completed her high-speed trials. 44.7 knots submerged. No submarine in the world had ever moved faster underwater. The liquid metal reactor had performed exactly as the designers at Malachite's Central Design Bureau promised it would, delivering power that turned the twin 7-bladed propellers into instruments of hydrodynamic violence. The commanding officer allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. His vessel could outrun any torpedo the Americans possessed. She could chase down their attack submarines and dictate engagement ranges. She had just rewritten the tactical doctrine of underwater warfare. Then the sonar operator raised his hand. Not a shout, not an alarm, just a raised hand and a face that had gone the color of old paper. The commanding officer crossed the control room in 4 steps. The sonar display showed return signatures at bearing 090, range 12,000 meters. Multiple contacts. American Los Angeles-class attack submarines, judging from the acoustic profile. They were traveling at flank speed, directly toward K-222's position. Impossible. K-222 had been running silent for the past 40 minutes, making barely 8 knots, well below the threshold where her revolutionary propulsion system generated detectable cavitation noise. She had crossed 3 separate thermal layers, specifically selected to deflect active sonar pulses. The Norwegian Sea in December offered acoustic conditions that should have rendered her invisible to passive detection systems. The commanding officer checked the chronometer. The Americans were closing at their maximum speed, not searching, hunting. The weapons officer reported all torpedo tubes ready. The commanding officer ordered a course change to bearing 180, speed increasing to 20 knots. K-222's hull groaned as the reactor spooled up, pumping superheated liquid metal through heat exchangers that fed steam to turbines generating 50,000 shaft horsepower. The submarine accelerated with a velocity that pressed men against bulkheads. 30 knots, 35. The tactical advantage that made K-222 legendary. The sonar operator's second raised hand came 6 minutes later. The American submarines had matched the course change, bearing 185 still closing, range now 8,000 meters. The commanding officer felt something cold settle in his chest. They were not reacting to K-222's maneuvers. They had anticipated them. He ordered another course change, this time to bearing 270, speed maintained at 35 knots. The submarine carved through the water column with the brutal efficiency of her titanium hull and experimental propellers. 3 minutes passed. The American contacts adjusted their heading to bearing 275. As if they had known. As if they were reading his orders before he gave them. The realization arrived with the clinical clarity of a medical diagnosis. The Americans were not searching for K-222. They had already found her. They were demonstrating that they could track the fastest submarine ever built through any evasive maneuver her commanding officer could conceive. They were waiting to see what else he would try. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. The commanding officer ordered K-222 to diving depth 300 meters and reduce speed to 6 knots. The American submarines maintained their formation, now at range 5,000 meters, perfectly positioned to intercept any attempt to reach international waters. For 23 minutes, K-222 drifted in the thermal layer, while her commanding officer confronted the tactical reality. His vessel, the pride of Soviet naval engineering, the submarine that could outrun torpedoes, had been tracked with casual precision by an enemy who should not have been able to detect her at all. The humiliation of the forced retreat would appear in his official report as training exercise concluded successfully. The truth would travel through different channels, in folders stamped with red classification markings that would cross desks in Moscow by the end of the week. Captain First Rank Anatoly Mikhailovich Pustintsev, commander of Project 671RT attack submarine, moving through the Barents Sea on January 9, 1971, experienced his own version of the nightmare when American P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft appeared directly above his position, despite textbook adherence to silent running protocols. The Orion dropped a pattern of sonobuoys that formed a perfect acoustic fence around his submarine's projected course. Not searching. Waiting. Commander of a Project 670 Scat cruise missile submarine operating near the GUK Gap on February 3, 1971, reported American destroyers vectoring toward his position within minutes of departing Severomorsk Naval Base. The destroyers maintained contact for 11 hours through 3 separate evasion attempts, including a high-speed sprint beneath a Norwegian merchant convoy. Captain Second Rank commanding Project 675 guided missile submarine. March 1971. Greenland Sea. American attack submarine maintaining trail position at distance of 2,000 meters for 6 hours. When the Soviet captain attempted emergency deep dive to 400 meters, the American vessel matched the maneuver within 90 seconds, as if anticipating it. The pattern recognition occurred simultaneously in multiple offices within the Soviet Naval Staff headquarters on Znamenka Street in Moscow. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, received the Consolidated Intelligence Summary on March 18, 1971. The conference room on the building's third floor smelled of cigarette smoke and the peculiar institutional odor of anxiety. 16 separate incidents documented in the first quarter of 1971 alone. 16 Soviet submarines detected, tracked, and in several cases actively harassed by NATO forces that should not have been able to locate them. The intelligence officers presented theories with the careful language of men who understood that wrong answers carried professional consequences. American satellite reconnaissance achieving thermal imaging capability beyond current Soviet estimates. Improved sonar processing, allowing passive detection at previously impossible ranges. Potential acoustic signatures from new reactor cooling systems. Each theory examined and documented with mathematical precision. Each theory failing to explain how American forces repeatedly appeared at exact intercept points before Soviet submarines arrived. Captain second rank in the Naval Intelligence Directorate proposed that NATO had developed long-range wake detection technology. The mathematics supported the possibility. Submarines moving through water created pressure disturbances that propagated to the surface. Theoretical models suggested these disturbances might remain detectable for hours under specific oceanographic conditions. The Admiral ordered feasibility studies. A commander from the main naval staff suggested compromise of submarine departure schedules through human intelligence penetration. The KGB's Third Chief Directorate began reviewing security protocols at every Northern Fleet submarine base. Sailors faced interrogations that lasted for days. Officers found their personal correspondence examined for signs of foreign contact. The paranoia metastasized through the submarine community like radiation through tissue. Submarine crews returning from patrol reported the psychological weight of operating under continuous surveillance. They described the sensation of being watched by an enemy they could not locate, tracked by methods they could not understand, hunted in an environment that should have protected them. The iron coffins had become glass coffins, visible to an enemy who somehow saw through steel and seawater and the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. In a secure facility outside Moscow, engineers reviewed the technical specifications of K222's liquid metal reactor and her unprecedented speed capabilities. If the fastest submarine ever built could be tracked and cornered, what protection remained for the conventional boats? How were the Americans finding them? The answer arrived not through brilliant deduction, but through catastrophic mechanical failure aboard the submarine that had started the investigation. May 22, 1971. K222 remained docked at Severomorsk Naval Base, her titanium hull reflecting the pale Arctic sunlight, while engineering crews worked inside compartments that had become progressively more dangerous with each operational patrol. The liquid metal coolant system, lead-bismuth eutectic alloy, maintained at temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Celsius, had developed leaks that no amount of welding could permanently seal. The chief engineer submitted his report with hands that trembled from more than cold. 8 separate breaches in the primary coolant loop. Toxic metal vapor escaping into the engineering compartment at concentrations that exceeded safety thresholds by factors of 12. Crew members exhibiting symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Tremors, cognitive impairment, lesions on exposed skin where lead-bismuth particles had made contact. The radiation exposure levels remained classified, but the engineering crew's medical records documented white blood cell counts that suggested the reactor shielding had proven inadequate during high-speed operations. The speed record that had made K222 legendary had been achieved by men breathing vaporized lead. The tactical advantage had cost them their bone marrow. Admiral Gorshkov ordered a comprehensive technical review of all experimental reactor systems currently in service or under development. The review would eventually encompass 47 separate engineering studies, but in May 1971, the focus remained fixed on understanding why the Americans could track Soviet submarines with such precision. The liquid metal coolant leaks aboard K222 represented a failure of engineering, not a failure of stealth. The submarine detection problem remained unsolved. The Naval Intelligence Directorate compiled data from signals intelligence intercepts, submarine patrol reports, and debriefings of every commanding officer who had experienced unexplained detection events. The analysis revealed geographical patterns. American forces demonstrated highest tracking accuracy in specific ocean areas. The Norwegian Sea approaches to the GIUK Gap, the Barents Sea north of Murmansk, the transit routes between Severomorsk and the Atlantic patrol areas. These were precisely the corridors Soviet submarines had to traverse to reach their operational zones. A captain in the intelligence section proposed a theory that initially seemed too simple to be correct. What if the Americans were not detecting submarines through advanced sensor technology? What if they were simply waiting in predetermined locations along known transit routes? The theory presumed extensive knowledge of Soviet naval operations, patrol schedules, and departure patterns. It presumed a level of intelligence penetration that contradicted every assumption about operational security. The KGB investigations intensified. Security officers examined communication protocols at submarine bases throughout the Northern Fleet. They reviewed personnel assignments, cross-referenced family connections, analyzed patterns of shore leave and personal contacts. They found nothing that explained the American tracking capability. The witch hunt consumed hundreds of investigative hours and destroyed several careers through guilt by association, but it produced no evidence of systemic intelligence compromise. Meanwhile, K222 remained at dock while engineers attempted to redesign the coolant containment system. The modifications required cutting through sections of the titanium pressure hull, a procedure that compromised the structural integrity that allowed the submarine to operate at extreme depths. Each repair introduced new potential failure points. The design that had achieved unprecedented underwater speed was proving impossible to maintain under operational conditions. The commanding officer of K222 faced a decision that would define the remainder of his naval career. Soviet naval leadership demanded the submarine return to operational status. The speed trials had demonstrated tactical capabilities that the Americans could not match. The detection problem affected all Soviet submarines, not just K222. Political pressure from the Ministry of Defense insisted that the Papa-class design represented the future of underwater warfare, despite the mounting evidence of its catastrophic flaws. The crew medical reports told a different story. 19 men from the engineering section exhibited symptoms requiring extended hospitalization. Blood tests revealed lead concentrations that would cause permanent neurological damage. Radiation dosimetry badges worn during the December speed trials showed exposure levels that exceeded annual limits by factors of 3. The submarine that could outrun torpedoes was poisoning the men who operated her. In June 1971, a commander from the Soviet naval staff visited Severomorsk to inspect K222 personally. He descended through the forward hatch into the command compartment, where residual heat from the reactor spaces raised ambient temperature to 38 degrees Celsius, even with the reactor shut down. The chemical smell of lead bismuth permeated every surface. In the engineering compartment, he observed the crystalline deposits where vaporized metal had condensed on cooler surfaces, beautiful and toxic. The inspection report acknowledged what the engineering crews already knew. The liquid metal reactor technology worked exactly as designed under laboratory conditions. It delivered unprecedented power density. It allowed speeds that conventional pressurized water reactors could not achieve. It also required maintenance procedures so complex and dangerous that operational deployment would inevitably result in crew casualties that exceeded acceptable parameters. The definition of acceptable parameters remained subject to interpretation. Soviet submarine doctrine had always prioritized tactical capability over crew comfort. Nuclear submarine operations inherently involved radiation exposure levels that Western navies would not tolerate. The question was not whether K-222 posed risks to her crew. All submarines posed risks, but whether those risks could be justified by corresponding tactical advantages. That calculation changed when intelligence analysts presented new data suggesting the Americans had developed methods to track K-222 specifically because of her unique propulsion system. The liquid metal reactor generated thermal signatures different from conventional submarines. The lead bismuth coolant, when it leaked into seawater through hull penetrations, created chemical traces that might be detectable through specialized sensors. The very technology that made K-222 fast was potentially making her visible. The theory remained unproven, but it introduced doubt into calculations that had previously seemed straightforward. If K-222's experimental reactor actually compromised her stealth characteristics, then her speed advantage became meaningless. A submarine that could be tracked could be targeted. A submarine that could be targeted could be destroyed, regardless of how fast she could run. Admiral Gorshkov convened a technical conference in Moscow to evaluate whether series production of Papa-class submarines should proceed as planned. 12 submarines were scheduled for construction. The conference would determine whether the Soviet Union committed resources to building a fleet of the fastest attack submarines in the world, or whether K-222 would remain a singular experimental vessel, the achievement of engineering that proved too dangerous and possibly too detectable for operational deployment. How did the Americans keep finding Soviet submarines? The technical conference convened July 14, 1971, in a secured room within the main naval staff building, where strategic decisions emerged from collision between engineering reality and political necessity. Admiral Gorshkov sat at the head of a table, surrounded by submarine designers from Malachite Design Bureau, reactor specialists from the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, operational commanders from the Northern Fleet, and intelligence officers carrying folders documenting every instance of American tracking success during the previous 8 months. The question before them was not whether K-222 represented a technical achievement. The speed record proved that conclusively, but whether that achievement could be transformed into tactical advantage, given the catastrophic maintenance requirements and the unexplained detection problem that plagued every Soviet submarine regardless of design. The chief designer from Malachite presented data with the defensive precision of a man whose professional reputation depended on convincing skeptical admirals that liquid metal reactor technology remained viable despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The lead bismuth coolant system could be redesigned with improved containment seals. The toxic vapor problem could be mitigated through enhanced ventilation systems and protective equipment for engineering crews. The radiation shielding could be upgraded using materials not available when K-222 was originally constructed. Each modification would add weight, reduce speed, increase complexity, and extend construction timelines by an estimated 18 months per vessel. A captain from the Northern Fleet Submarine Command offered operational perspective. K-222's speed advantage provided tactical options unavailable to conventional submarines. She could sprint to intercept American carrier battle groups. She could pursue and destroy enemy submarines attempting to evade engagement. She could transit the GUK gap in timeframes that reduced exposure to NATO anti-submarine forces. These capabilities justified accepting elevated risk to crew health and mechanical reliability. The intelligence officer presented the argument that ended the discussion. He laid out photographs on the conference table showing K-222's titanium hull at dock in Severomorsk. The photographs had been taken by American reconnaissance satellites. The next series of photographs showed heat signatures detected during K-222's December speed trials, thermal blooms visible from orbit where superheated reactor coolant transferred energy through the hull into surrounding seawater. The Americans were not detecting K222 through acoustic signatures or wake patterns. They were watching her from space. The thermal signature problem applied specifically to liquid metal reactor technology. Conventional pressurized water reactors operated at lower temperatures with better thermal insulation. The lead bismuth coolant in K222's reactor ran hot enough to create infrared signatures detectable through satellite-based sensors that the Soviet intelligence services had not known existed until American technical capabilities were reassessed following the submarine tracking incidents. Every time K222 operated her reactor at high power, she announced her position to satellites passing overhead every 93 minutes. This explained the pattern of American intercepts. NATO forces were not tracking Soviet submarines continuously. They were receiving periodic position updates from satellite reconnaissance, then deploying maritime patrol aircraft and attack submarines to areas where Soviet vessels had been detected. The speed at which K222 could run became irrelevant when the Americans knew her location before she began evasive maneuvers. The implications extended beyond K222. All Soviet submarines generated thermal signatures. The question was whether those signatures exceeded detection thresholds for American satellite sensors. Analysis suggested that conventional submarines operating at normal reactor power levels produced thermal outputs that blended with ocean background temperatures when viewed from orbit. K222's liquid metal reactor, running at 300 degrees Celsius to achieve maximum power output, created thermal anomalies that stood out like signal flares against the cold Norwegian Sea. Admiral Gorshkov terminated the series production program on July 20, 1971. The decision appeared in classified naval construction orders as postponement pending resolution of technical issues, but the engineering community understood the reality. K222 would remain the only Papa-class submarine ever built. The fastest submarine in the world had become a tactical liability because her speed required reactor temperatures that made her visible to an enemy watching from above. K222 remained in service, but her operational profile changed fundamentally. No more high-speed trials. No more attempts to demonstrate her ability to outrun American torpedoes. She operated at reduced power settings that kept reactor temperatures below satellite detection thresholds. She became an experimental platform for testing equipment rather than a frontline attack submarine. Her crew continued to suffer from lead bismuth exposure despite improved ventilation systems. The liquid metal coolant continued to leak despite repeated repairs. The commanding officer who had achieved the speed record received promotion and transfer to a shore command position. He had not failed in his mission. He had commanded K222 during trials that proved Soviet engineering could achieve performance levels the Americans could not match. That the achievement came with costs in crew health and tactical vulnerability did not diminish the technical accomplishment. In Soviet naval culture, the willingness to accept extreme risks in pursuit of tactical advantage was not a flaw, but a feature. The submarine detection problem that had initiated the investigation remained partially solved. American satellite reconnaissance explained many of the tracking incidents, but not all of them. Some Soviet submarines with conventional reactors had been tracked with precision that suggested detection methods beyond thermal imaging. The Naval Intelligence Directorate continued analyzing patrol reports, searching for patterns that might reveal other American sensor capabilities. K222 was finally decommissioned in 1988. Her liquid metal reactor shut down permanently after 17 years of progressively more limited operations. The reactor compartment required special handling during decommissioning because the lead bismuth coolant had solidified into radioactive metal that could not be safely removed. The submarine that outran torpedoes ended her service as a toxic monument to the Cold War principle that tactical advantage justified any cost, including the health of the men who operated the weapon systems. The crew members who served aboard K222 during her speed trials received medical monitoring for conditions associated with heavy metal poisoning and radiation exposure. Some developed cancers that appeared in medical records with the bureaucratic notation service-related illness. The documentation acknowledged cause without assigning responsibility. They had been part of an experiment that achieved its technical objectives, while demonstrating that some achievements carry prices too high for sustained deployment. The speed record still stands. 44.7 knots submerged. No submarine has ever moved faster underwater. The record represents both the pinnacle of Soviet submarine engineering and the proof that Cold War competition drove both superpowers toward technologies so dangerous that the men operating them became test subjects in experiments measuring the acceptable boundaries of human exposure to industrial toxins and ionizing radiation in pursuit of tactical superiority that satellite reconnaissance rendered obsolete before the submarines left port.